What if the most dangerous version of Newspeak was never in the past, but inside the way you and I speak right now? Because here's the uncomfortable question: if language doesn't just describe reality, but actually shapes what reality can exist in your mind, then who exactly is choosing the limits of what you're allowed to think? And more importantly, when did you agree to those limits? We usually think of language as a tool. Something neutral. A bridge between thought and expression. But in the world of 1984, Newspeak was never designed to help communication. It was designed to narrow it. To remove the very possibility of certain thoughts by removing the words that carry them. Memory fragment: if there is no word for rebellion, rebellion becomes harder to imagine. Now pause on that. Not as fiction, but as structure. Because here's the first shift in perspective: Newspeak is not just a language in a dystopian novel. It is a model of control where vocabulary is not expanded to express truth, but reduced to eliminate complexity. And that raises a disturbing insight: what happens when a society starts preferring simpler language, faster communication, shorter expressions, not for clarity, but for efficiency? This is where the contradiction begins. We believe simplification equals progress. Shorter messages. Easier words. Faster understanding. But what if simplification is also compression of thought itself? What if every time complexity is removed from language, a layer of thinking is quietly removed with it? In Oceania, the role of Newspeak wasn't to convince people of lies. It was more precise than that. It was to make certain truths unthinkable. Big Brother didn't need to argue against rebellion. He just needed to make the language for rebellion disappear. And that leads to a deeper escalation: if you remove the words for injustice, nuance, contradiction, resistance, do those ideas still survive in full form inside the mind? Or do they slowly dissolve into something you can feel, but no longer fully articulate? Memory fragment: a thought without language is a shadow that cannot fully take shape. Now bring that forward into your world, not as metaphor, but as structure. Because today, language doesn't disappear through censorship alone. It disappears through optimization. Through trends. Through algorithms that reward clarity over depth, speed over precision, engagement over complexity. The result is not silence, it is simplification. And here's the unsettling consequence: when expression becomes compressed, thinking begins to follow the same shape. Not because someone forced it, but because there are fewer linguistic paths available to walk through. This is the hidden scale shift. From individual vocabulary to collective cognition. From what you say to what you are capable of noticing. So the real question is no longer whether Newspeak exists in fiction. The real question is whether any system that reduces expressive complexity inevitably reduces cognitive complexity as well. And if that is true, then we are left with a final, unresolved tension. What disappears first, ideas themselves, or the language that would have allowed us to recognize that we lost them? The deeper you go into language, the more unsettling the question becomes: are we shaping words, or are words quietly shaping the boundaries of what we are capable of noticing in the first place? Because if thought depends on available language structures, then the real issue is not what we choose to say, but what we no longer have the tools to say at all. And that leads to a more uncomfortable extension of the conflict: what if control does not require censorship in the traditional sense, but only subtle restriction of expressive range? Not silence. Just narrowing. Not erasure. Just simplification. In the system described within 1984, Newspeak operates with a brutal clarity of purpose. It does not argue with ideas. It removes their linguistic foundation. And once that foundation is gone, even rebellion becomes structurally incomplete. Memory fragment: when language collapses inward, imagination loses its external direction. But here is where the perspective shifts again. Because in the modern environment, no one is formally reducing vocabulary through decree. Instead, language is being shaped by efficiency. By compression. By what can be said in under 10 seconds. By what fits into a headline. By what survives an algorithmic feed. So the question is no longer about control through force. It becomes control through design. And that creates a contradiction that is difficult to ignore. The more accessible communication becomes, the more constrained conceptual depth appears to get. Not because ideas disappear outright, but because they are forced to compete within tighter expressive containers. This is where the role of Newspeak evolves. It is no longer a language imposed by a state. It becomes a structural tendency embedded in communication systems themselves. And that shift changes everything. Because once language becomes optimized for speed and engagement, certain forms of thinking begin to lose survival advantage. Complex ideas require time. Nuance requires space. Ambiguity requires patience. But none of those traits align with compressed communication ecosystems. Revelation begins to surface here, not as a conclusion, but as an uncomfortable pattern. The structure of language determines which thoughts feel worth thinking because only certain thoughts can be easily expressed, shared, and reinforced. Memory fragment: a society does not lose ideas suddenly, it loses the ability to carry them. And this is where scale shift becomes unavoidable. What begins as a linguistic phenomenon inside a fictional regime starts to resemble a systemic property of modern communication environments. From political messaging to social media discourse, the same compression dynamic appears in different forms, each one reinforcing the next. But the consequence is not just miscommunication. It is cognitive asymmetry. Some ideas become naturally thinkable because they are easy to express. Others become silently rare, not because they are forbidden, but because they are structurally expensive to maintain in conversation. And that raises a more unsettling implication: if complexity has a cost in attention, and attention is the primary currency of modern discourse, then what kinds of thinking are slowly being priced out of existence? We are left with attention that refuses to resolve cleanly. If language shapes thought, and systems shape language, then who is ultimately shaping the boundaries of what can be thought at all? And beneath that lies an even deeper uncertainty: are we witnessing the expansion of communication, or the quiet standardization of what it is even possible to mean? But here is where the tension stops being theoretical and starts becoming structural. If language is shaped by systems, and systems are shaped by incentives, then the real question is no longer what is being said, but what kinds of thinking are being silently filtered out before they ever reach expression. At this point, the conflict is no longer between truth and lies. It becomes a conflict between what can survive inside a communication environment and what cannot. And that is where the crisis begins. Because in the world of 1984, the function of linguistic control was never to eliminate disagreement. It was to eliminate the cognitive architecture needed to sustain disagreement in the first place. Memory fragment: when a concept loses linguistic stability, it loses historical continuity. Now apply that logic forward. If modern communication systems reward compression, speed, and emotional immediacy, then ideas that require layered reasoning begin to lose structural support. Not because they are disproven, but because they are underexpressed. And what is underexpressed long enough begins to feel unnecessary. That is the contradiction at the core of the system. We believe we are expanding communication capacity. But at the same time, we are reducing the durability of complex thought structures. And here is where escalation becomes unavoidable. Because once a society begins to favor communicative efficiency over conceptual depth, the cost is not immediate. It is delayed. It appears first as fragmentation, then as polarization, then as a subtle collapse of shared conceptual vocabulary. Ideas do not disappear. They become untranslatable. And this is where the role of language shifts again. Language is no longer just a medium of expression. It becomes a selection environment for thought. Certain ideas thrive because they are simple to encode. Others wither because they require too many dependencies to survive. In fast-moving discourse, memory fragment: what cannot be compressed cannot circulate. What cannot circulate begins to vanish. The influence of this shift is not centralized. There is no single authority issuing commands. Instead, influence is distributed across platforms, interfaces, and attention systems that reward clarity over complexity. This is the new form of control, not prohibition, but prioritization. And the consequence is subtle but profound. Individuals begin to adapt their thinking unconsciously. Not by losing intelligence, but by reshaping cognition to fit expressive constraints. Thoughts become shorter. Arguments become thinner. Nuance becomes optional instead of essential. And over time, this reshaping creates a new baseline of what feels normal to think. This is where escalation reaches its most unstable point. Because if the structure of expression determines the structure of thought, and the structure of thought determines what a society can collectively recognize as real, then reality itself becomes partially dependent on communicative architecture. So the question is no longer whether Newspeak exists as a defined system. The question becomes whether any system that rewards simplification is inevitably performing a similar function, quietly filtering the upper limits of what human thought can sustain. And if that is true, then the most important ideas are not the ones that are spoken more clearly, but the ones that are slowly becoming harder to say at all, even when we know they are there. And somewhere inside that silence, a deeper mechanism begins to emerge, one that has not yet fully revealed what it is selecting for, or what it is eliminating. At this point, the real question is no longer how language influences thought, but what kind of reality only becomes stable once language forces it into a consistent structure. Revelation begins here. Newspeak is not simply about reducing vocabulary or limiting expression, it is about enforcing a closed loop between perception and permissible meaning, where only ideas that can survive linguistic compression are allowed to exist as stable thoughts inside a shared mind space. In this light, the system inside 1984 was never trying to silence disagreement in the traditional sense, it was trying to eliminate semantic instability itself, the kind of ambiguity that allows competing interpretations of reality to coexist. Memory fragment: when meaning cannot stabilize, reality cannot anchor. This reveals a deeper structure. Language is not a mirror of thought, it is the environment where thought must prove it can survive. If a concept cannot remain coherent under simplified grammar, it does not disappear violently, it dissolves gradually into cognitive invisibility. And this is where the true insight emerges. The core mechanism is not restriction, but selection. Language becomes a filter that decides which forms of thinking are structurally viable enough to persist across minds, time, and communication. Everything else fades not because it is forbidden, but because it is too complex to remain stable when transmitted. This shifts the entire conflict from censorship to survivability. Ideas are not killed, they fail to replicate. Memory fragment: only thoughts that can be repeated without distortion survive the system. And here the consequence becomes far more profound than earlier stages suggested. If only simplified or structurally stable ideas can propagate reliably, then collective intelligence gradually adapts to favor those patterns, not because they are true, but because they are transmissible. Over time, this creates a silent inversion. Complexity does not get rejected, it gets filtered out by the physics of communication itself. Scale shift becomes unavoidable at this stage. What appears as individual language choice is actually part of a larger cognitive ecosystem where meaning is constantly being optimized for replication efficiency. In such a system, even disagreement must become simplified to remain communicable, which means opposition itself begins to inherit the constraints of what it resists. This is the hidden power of Newspeak as a conceptual engine. It does not erase thought directly, it restructures the conditions under which thought can remain stable across minds. And once this mechanism is seen clearly, a deeper revelation emerges. Beneath it, the boundary between what is thinkable and what is sayable is not fixed by consciousness, but by the structural tolerance of language systems to carry complexity without collapsing it into noise. Memory fragment: a thought that cannot survive translation between minds becomes indistinguishable from silence. And so the question transforms again, because if language is a selection environment rather than a passive tool, then every communication system becomes a silent curator of reality itself, deciding not only what is expressed, but what can endure long enough to be recognized as real. And this leads to a final, destabilizing uncertainty. If reality is filtered through what language can consistently preserve, then what else has already been filtered out of collective awareness not by force, but by inability to survive the structure of expression itself, and what forms of thought are still existing at the edge of language, waiting for the moment they can finally become sayable? At this point, the deepest question is no longer about whether language shapes thought, but whether thought itself can exist in any stable form without a system that continuously selects, stabilizes, and filters it into communicable structure. Core revelation: what we call reality inside shared human experience is not the totality of thought or perception, but only the fraction of cognition that can survive repeated translation through language without collapsing into ambiguity or distortion. This means Newspeak, as embodied in 1984, was never simply a tool of oppression. It was a demonstration of a structural law: only thoughts that can be linguistically stabilized become socially real. Everything else remains private, fragmented, or eventually unthinkable, not by force, but by non-replicability. Memory fragment: reality is not what is seen. It is what survives being said more than once without breaking apart. This reframes the entire system. The role of language is not passive transmission, but active selection of cognitive survivability. Influence is no longer centralized in authority figures like Big Brother or intermediaries like O'Brien, but distributed across the architecture of expression itself. Their function becomes symbolic, not creators of control, but administrators of stability within a system where instability equals disappearance. Now the insight expands further. If only compressible thoughts persist across communication networks, then complexity does not vanish suddenly, it decays through transmission loss. Each simplification is not a loss of truth, but a narrowing of its survivable form. Over time, entire regions of meaning become inaccessible not because they are forbidden, but because they cannot maintain coherence under repeated linguistic compression. Memory fragment: what cannot be stabilized in language becomes indistinguishable from what was never thought at all. The consequence of this is not merely intellectual simplification, but structural homogenization of consciousness. Societies begin to converge not around shared beliefs, but around shared limits of expression. This is the hidden architecture behind cognitive alignment, not agreement of ideas, but convergence of what can be reliably articulated without distortion. Scale shift emerges here in its final form. The mechanism is no longer about individual cognition or even cultural discourse. It becomes a property of civilization itself. The collective mind only contains what its communication systems can continuously preserve without entropy. And anything beyond that threshold becomes invisible by default. The legacy of this structure is profound. Newspeak was not a warning about a fictional regime. It was a compressed model of how all communicative systems tend toward selection pressure, where only the most stable linguistic forms survive long enough to define shared reality. And stability, in this sense, does not equal truth. It equals repeatability. This leads to a philosophical rupture. If reality is defined by what survives linguistic transmission, then truth is not discovered, it is maintained. And maintenance always requires reduction. Not because truth is simple, but because complexity is fragile under repeated encoding. Memory fragment: every time meaning is preserved, something in it is quietly simplified. And so the core conflict resolves into something far more unsettling than control versus freedom. It becomes a tension between richness of thought and survivability of expression. The more complex an idea becomes, the more likely it is to be lost not through rejection, but through breakdown in transmission across minds, time, and systems of language. This is the silent mechanism that reshapes intellectual landscapes without any visible act of suppression. And now the final question emerges, not as an extension of the system, but as a rupture in it. If only what can be repeatedly expressed without degradation becomes part of shared reality, then what parts of human thought have already been permanently excluded from civilization not because they were denied, but because they were never structurally able to survive the journey from mind to language to memory? At this stage, the consequence is no longer abstract or theoretical. It becomes structural, embedded in the way consciousness itself is distributed across communication, memory, and repetition. Because if only what can survive repeated linguistic transmission becomes part of shared reality, then everything that cannot survive that process does not simply disappear, it becomes historically absent without ever being explicitly erased. The system inside 1984 understood this at a foundational level. The role of Newspeak was not just to restrict vocabulary, but to ensure that certain forms of thought could not achieve long-term stability across generations. Its influence was not measured in what people were forced to say, but in what gradually stopped being necessary to say at all. Memory fragment: what is not repeatedly expressed becomes indistinguishable from what was never real. The consequence of this logic extends beyond language into cognition itself. When expression is filtered by stability and repeatability, thought begins to reorganize around what can be safely transmitted without distortion. This creates a silent selection pressure where unstable ideas are not opposed, but simply outcompeted by more compressible ones. Over time, this produces a different kind of intellectual environment. Not one defined by censorship, but by survivability bias. Certain ideas persist not because they are more accurate, but because they are more structurally durable under repetition. And this is where the legacy of the system becomes visible. Newspeak, as a concept, is not a historical artifact. It is a demonstration of how any communication ecosystem naturally tends toward compression when efficiency becomes more valuable than depth. The legacy is not linguistic, it is cognitive. It reveals that the architecture of language determines the architecture of collective memory. Memory fragment: civilizations do not forget ideas. They stop being able to carry them. This leads to a deeper expansion of scale. What begins as linguistic constraint evolves into epistemic constraint, where the boundaries of knowledge itself are shaped by what can remain stable under constant reinterpretation. In such a system, knowledge is not just discovered, it is continuously reconstructed through the limitations of expression. The influence of this mechanism does not require intention. No central authority is needed to maintain it. Instead, it emerges naturally from the interaction between communication speed, attention limits, and the necessity of simplification for transferability. And that is the most important shift. Control is no longer a deliberate act. It becomes an emergent property of communication systems optimized for survival in high-velocity information environments. Memory fragment: the system does not erase complexity. It filters it out until only what is repeatable remains. From a philosophical standpoint, this forces a re-evaluation of what it means for a society to know something. If knowledge must survive repetition to remain socially real, then knowledge is not just a representation of truth, it is a negotiation between truth and transmissibility. And here lies the deeper emotional consequence, the realization that much of what feels like shared understanding may already be the compressed residue of ideas that once existed in more complex forms. Not lost suddenly, but gradually simplified until their original structure is no longer recoverable. So the final reflection is not about whether language controls thought, but whether thought itself is always being reshaped by the limits of what can endure within communication. And if that is the case, then the most unsettling question remains unresolved: what kinds of human understanding have already passed through language so many times that only their simplest shadows remain, and how would we even recognize what has been lost if the very structure needed to describe it no longer survives? In the end, the most important realization is not that language controls thought, or even that systems shape expression, but that human consciousness itself is only ever experienced through the narrow corridor of what can be successfully translated into shared meaning. And that changes everything about how we interpret what was once seen as fiction inside 1984. Because the legacy of Newspeak is not a historical warning frozen in time. Its legacy is a living demonstration of how fragile complex thought becomes once it is forced to pass through systems that prioritize stability, speed, and repetition over depth. It shows that meaning does not survive by being true. It survives by being transmittable. Memory fragment: what endures is not what is deepest, but what can be carried without breaking. This is the final shift in perspective. The influence of language is not limited to what it allows us to say. It extends into what we are able to remember as thinkable in the first place. Over time, the boundary between expression and cognition dissolves, until thinking itself begins to mirror the constraints of communication. And this is where the human meaning of the entire structure becomes unavoidable. Because it suggests that every generation does not simply inherit knowledge. It inherits a filtered version of reality, shaped by what previous systems were able to preserve without distortion. What feels like intellectual progress may also be selective preservation, where only certain forms of complexity survive the passage through language, media, and collective memory. Memory fragment: every era speaks, but only fragments of its mind survive translation into the next. The emotional weight of this realization is not about loss in the dramatic sense. It is about quiet reduction. Ideas do not vanish loudly. They thin out. They become easier to repeat, easier to share, easier to digest, until their original density is no longer recognizable, even if their surface remains intact. And yet, this is not a story of despair. It is a story of structure. Because once this mechanism is seen clearly, language is no longer just a tool we use. It becomes something we participate in maintaining. Every act of expression becomes part of the selection process that determines which thoughts remain stable enough to continue existing in shared consciousness. This is the final philosophical reflection. If reality is the collection of thoughts that can survive communication, then reality itself is always partially engineered by the limits of how meaning can travel between minds. Memory fragment: reality is not only what is seen. It is what survives being said across time without losing its shape. And so the legacy of Newspeak is not that it predicts a single future. It reveals a permanent tension inside human communication itself. A tension between depth and survivability, between complexity and transmission, between what can be fully thought and what can be fully carried. The question that remains is not historical. It is existential. If every system of communication inevitably filters out what cannot be stabilized, then what parts of human thought have always been too complex to survive, and have we ever truly lived inside the full range of what the human mind is capable of, or only inside what language has allowed to remain?